From the Virginia Audio Collective at WTJU 91.1 FM and Brown College at the University of Virginia, this is Symposia. In cooperation with the Charlottesville Sister Cities Commission and America 2026, Symposia is proud to present Sister Revolutions.
In 1882, in the Third Republic, historian Édouard Clerc opened his History of the Estates General and Public Liberties in Franche-Comté as follows. La Franche-Comté était un pays libre. Son nom le disait déjà il y a plus de 400 ans, et le rappelle encore aujourd'hui. Franche-Comté was a free country. Its name already said so more than 400 years ago, and its name still reminds us of that today.
So in 1776, the American Declaration of Independence is signed. America is launched into revolution.
Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence.
There you go. What does France think about this?
Well, Louis XVI, who is King of France at the time, is going to be a major financial supporter of the American War of Independence. In large part, this is out of their rivalry with Great Britain.
Can this French and American connection help us understand better what were the tensions at the time period?
That's a great question, Sage. I actually know exactly the person we need to ask. Leila Tenanchi is a graduate student at the University of Burgundy-Franche-Comté who's written a dissertation about troves of letters that everyday French people wrote to their celebrity hero, Benjamin Franklin, the famous American statesman who spent time in France. And through their letters, she uses this epistolary archive as a way to understand the tensions and problems that French people were facing in the 1770s and 80s through this parasocial relationship with their American celebrity hero.
He had around 2,000 French correspondents. It's enormous.
So what kind of information, did these letters reveal to you? I mean, we can start with why are these people writing to Franklin in the first place?
All had the same reasons as many other French people from other provinces. One of them wished to obtain some news about a relative who fought in America besides the insurgents. Another one wanted to become a privateer in the service of the Americans, hoping to make a fortune, of course. Another one wished to emigrate to the United States and found a glass factory. Here we observe a local specificity because the art of glass was well developed in Franche-Comté. Many French people wrote to Franklin in order to emigrate to America, and some of them had entrepreneurial spirit. Three of the correspondents from Franche-Comté wanted to join the French and American forces. The first one was a nobleman who wished to find a job as an officer, and the second one as a chaplain. He was a monk, but he didn't have the calling. His parents forced their younger son to become a clergyman. He was from a noble family, and his older brothers had already left to fight in America. He felt so useless and had dreams of battles and glory. And he specified in his letter that he wanted to fight for his king, such as most of the French volunteers for the War of Independence. The aristocrats had no many career choices: the army, the magistrature, or the church. The letters of the volunteers who wrote to Franklin shows us the big problem of unemployment experienced by French officers in that time. And the third one wanted to join the army as a surgeon. He exposed a problem common to all surgeons of that period. They were not as well regarded as doctors, and they wanted to improve their knowledge and experience in medicine. And this was only possible on ships, which only rarely had a doctor on board, but rather a surgeon. Another letter is very interesting and representative. Not of Franche-Comté, but again of the French provincial nobility. A nobleman sent to Franklin a medal of the King of France, Henry IV. He wanted Franklin to send it to Washington, who was his American challenger in the heart of French people. Washington was regarded as the ultimate warrior, brave and, selfless. In fact, he embodied the values of the aristocracy such as honor. So, what do we learn with the correspondence with nearly no local specificity? Well, we understand that the Franche-Comté is part of a whole, France.
Sage, some exciting news since we met with Layla. She's actually defended her thesis. She's a doctor now.
That's so wonderful. That's so great.
Yeah, it's very cool.
We'll hear another mention of Benjamin Franklin's written correspondence with the French later on. But for now, let's turn our focus back to what's happening in Besançon in the late 18th century. We left our last episode off by talking about the Céline Royale and sort of the beauty of the Enlightenment and this outpouring of creativity and art.
And sense of hope and possibility.
Exactly. How do we get from there to the French Revolution?
This is one of these classic questions for a history lecture course, right? I'll give you the kind of short answer. There are long-term origins that have to do with the rising literacy rates, rising middle classes, more people feeling like they can participate in the management of institutions and economies. The short-term and medium-term causes really have a lot to do as well with state finance and taxation. The monarchy accumulated a huge amount of debt, losing the 7 Years' War in large part, which ended in 1763. They had gone through a series of failed reforms to the 1770s and 80s. The American Revolution was also a very expensive enterprise. The monarchy faced a series of financial crises through the 1780s with looming bankruptcy that necessitated really extreme measures to reform the finances of the state. They also faced a series of legitimacy crises around the image of the royal family, so the king is sort of increasingly perceived as a normal person with foibles and vices like anyone else. And so these factors really come together by the late 1780s.
So, since our focus for this project is specifically on Besançon, how exactly are we going to approach the very large and sprawling conflict that is the French Revolution?
Yeah, seriously. We can already see some of the themes of this episode emerging that we should be listening for in our subsequent interviews. One is this tension between the macro and the micro, a national story versus local particularity. So, does Besançon fit the narrative of the French Revolution overall, or is it different? A second issue that comes up in the memory of the French Revolution is, we might phrase it as, how bad was the terror? So is the quote-unquote real revolution the moderate, aristocratic, or recently ennobled bourgeois magistrates who read Montesquieu and who were all about kind of constitutional monarchy and moderation? Or is the real revolution the kind of Rousseau-reading Jacobins with extremely staunch beliefs about equality and fraternity, and how bad was the violence and who's to blame? To get us started answering these questions, we have been working with one of the doctoral students here at the University of Virginia, Oriane Guiziou-Lamour, who is a scholar of 18th century French literature, and we asked her to do some research in the library to see what she could come up with about the revolution in Besançon.
In the French educational system, when we learn about this, you have this idea that it's very centralized, that the events happened in Paris, that everything unraveled in Paris. And so when I dig deeper into Besançon, I thought, okay, I'm probably not going to find that many interesting elements or timelines, but I realized that everything is connected, and the big yes, who would have thought? And that the big events that were happening in Paris also happened in a parallel way in Besançon. The French Revolution started with the Prise de la Bastille.
Right, the storming of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789.
Yes, but it has to be placed in the wider context of the very poor harvest that came in the year before and the rising cost of wheat. You can place the beginning of the French Revolution in Besançon on the le 30 et le 31 mars.
The 30th and 31st of March
yes.
Of 1789.
1789, so a few months before the storming of the Bastille, and you might wonder, oh, did it start in Besançon? But no, it's all linked, because the poor harvest affected all the country, the entire French kingdom. There were a lot of riots because people wanted to buy wheat and they couldn't. So les boulangers, the bakers, were chahutés, were harassed. They didn't know that a few months later this crisis would be generalized.
Here's historian André Ferrer again on the intellectual context at that moment.
The big ideas conveyed by the revolution came here before 1789, through the Enlightenment spirit that permeates the Comtois elite, way before the revolution. These ideas were conveyed by philosophers, by Montesquieu, Voltaire.
In order to figure out what kind of reforms the monarchy and the state would need to make, in convening the Estates General, they had provincial estates draw up what were called cahiers de doléances, notebooks or accounts of grievances. These are amazing records that historians can use to try to understand the complaints that people living across the kingdom had in the 1780s.
They almost felt that the wind was changing. Besançon, when it was integrated in the French kingdom, or rather when it was conquered, there was a sort of compromise. There was an agreement that Besançon would have its own rules in a way, things that weren't happening in the rest of the kingdom. And so some cahiers de doléances ask that these privileges are respected. They generally agree with the spirit of the revolution. You can feel that very early on in the cahiers de doléances, but they also say that they would like to keep their privileges as a city, as a particularist city.
Okay.
For instance, l'exemption de la gabelle. So the gabelle, how would you...
The salt tax.
Yes, the salt tax. They were exempted from it in Besançon, and they asked that this exemption would remain. What is interesting about the cahiers de doléances is also that although they ask for this respect of privileges, they also say in a very interesting way, I think, okay, if the general good of the kingdom requires us to give up on these privileges, we agree to that. So I think it's a very interesting double discourse almost, as if to say, we like the French Revolution, but please leave us our privileges. But also, if you don't, it's okay. I think it's a very, very interesting back and forth between the two.
I'd heard from a colleague here at the University of Virginia about a famous example of one of the cahiers de doléances, these lists of grievances, drawn up close to Besançon, in which one of the things that they called for was actually the abolition of slavery. So I asked André if he knew anything about this document.
Alors c'est un cahier de doléances d'un village de Haute-Saône.
It's a register of grievances from a village in today's Haute-Saône, so north of Franche-Comté, which asks, indeed, for the abolition of slavery, which was quite rare at the time.
On a d'ailleurs, c'est Champagné, le village, et on a créé un musée
The village is called Champagné, and a museum, the House of Negritude and Human Rights, was created there to honor this register of grievances. A particularly surprising register when you consider that people in this region didn't know much about slavery, although there were a few plantation owners amongst the nobility. For instance, they owned plantations in Saint-Domingue, modern-day Haiti.
Plantation à Saint-Domingue, notamment.
I knew that here in Charlottesville, Virginia, folks are really interested in learning more about the legacy of the slave trade and its impact on institutions that continue to exist today, to say nothing of descendants of enslaved people. And I wondered whether there was some equivalent of this happening in Besançon, even though it's not a port city. Presumably, it still might have been affected by France's global empire.
Yes, here we are far from the seas. The situation is quite different from the Atlantic seaboard.
Voltaire himself was a shareholder.
Yes, that's true. Voltaire was a stockholder of companies which emerged from the slave trade. Indeed. As I was saying, there were a few plantation owners who owned plantations in Saint-Domingue, but we're talking about extremely rare cases.
So as much as the monarchy is at the center of a lot of the issues that French people are having at the time, I imagine it's not the only institution of governance that is up on the chopping block.
Yeah, a little guillotine humor there. So that's exactly right. One of the best examples of this is going to be the church. So, you'll remember that the clergy is one of the three estates of the governance of the French kingdom. And in Besançon and Franche-Comté, it happens to be populated by clergymen who feel very strongly in the independence of the Roman Church and of the Pope over the power of the French monarch. And so Franche-Comté is really a stronghold of what are called ultramontane or anti-Gallican priests. This also becomes an important center for the Jesuit order. And so just as the king would flee France later in the Revolution and the Comte d'Artois would flee to Turin, many clergy and nobles in Franche-Comté left for England, Switzerland, or Germany. So in the summer of 1790, revolutionaries actually implemented what's called the civil constitution of the clergy, where they would subordinate the church to the new revolutionary French state. And we actually heard a little bit about this touring the Cathedral of Saint-Jean. This was extremely polarizing in Franche-Comté. Only 29% of clerics actually signed on to become priests under the new state church. In Besançon itself, in the urban center, that figure's a little higher at 36%, so about 1/3. The historian Daniel Watkins has noted that a lot of priests actually fled to Fribourg, which is today one of Besançon's sister cities, and they set up a seminary there. And then that era went the other way. After Napoleon came to power, many of them came back and the church started to build itself back up. So this is another perfect example of revolutionaries trying to kind of modify or wipe out or repurpose and refigure old institutions. Where are we in the story here, in the chronology? So the estates of Franche-Comté have been convened. The Estates General have happened in the summer of 1789, and the Bastille has been stormed. There's actually a story that gets repeated that the first person to breach the Bastille prison was actually from Dole, near Besançon. In the region, we are going to see the pillaging of around 150 castles in Burgundy and Franche-Comté. Revolutionaries start to take over the forests, the forges, the institutions. They start burning archives. And yet the overall goal, according to some historians, seems to have been to implement the grievances from their cahiers de doléances. There's a great fear that aristocrats might try to seize back power violently. The French Revolution radicalizes through 1792. Revolutionaries proclaim a republic, so they're no longer a constitutional monarchy. The king is put on trial in December of 92, and he's executed the following month. The Reign of Terror will begin in the summer of 1793 as the Jacobins seize power, and especially the Committee of Public Safety under Maximilien Robespierre. The Jacobins, one of the things that they're known for actually is their misogyny. They argue that a monarchy is an immoral form of government because it accords power to women, such as the Queen Marie Antoinette. So the question becomes, in what ways did women contribute to revolutionary ideas and action under these circumstances?
I was obviously very interested in looking at what was the implication that women had in Besançon during the French Revolution. The Club des Amis de la Vérité et de l'Égalité, so the French Revolution was big on clubs. They loved clubs reuniting over a subject, and it was very important for women. It was created in Besançon around October 1792. And for women, it represented the opportunity to get involved in the political sphere. Each week, between 60 and 80 women debate in the Chapelle des Capucins. So you really have an alternative democratic system almost. You know, they were very conscious that they were being left out of French politics and Besançon politics. So they created their own sphere where they could discuss and propose ideas and write petitions.
Suzanne Desson writes, the citoyenne Maugrat laid forth the Besançon women's plan to enlighten feeble consciences and propagate liberty. She stated simply, quote, raised to the heights of the revolution, we prefer liberty and equality to all the platitudes of love. this was in the context of strengthening these calls for reforming laws around marriage and the gendered basis of citizenship.
The figure of a citoyenne whose name is Maugrat proposed to forbid men from entering the atelier des ouvrières, so preventing men from entering a working space.
A women's working space.
A women's working space, making it exclusively women working space. And I think through this detail you really see how they are well aware that they need to transcend their social background and come together. As cheesy as it might sound, but to come together to try and shift the political view on women during the revolution. The more the revolution realizes the danger that women represent, and the more they ask for rights and for actual equality, the harder it gets for them. And it culminates in October 1793, where women's clubs are forbidden, which also comes a few months after the forbidding of women in armies. And it's very interesting to see that in 1793 you really have a very clear political stance that we are trying to limit the role of women.
The revolutionary events in some regions really stand out. For instance, the bloody massacre of counter-revolutionary Catholic armies in the west of France in a region called the Vendée. That was pretty unique in France, and the memory of those events is still very sensitive. I asked our doctoral student, Oriane Guiziou-Lamour, and Franche-Comté historian André Ferrer if they found any other regional particularities to the experience in Besançon, either from geography or from war.
Very early on, the Franco-Swiss border in the Besançon area became a hotspot for political tensions. And so there were two crises, one in 1791 and one in 1792. Basically fears of invasion, and people had to come in and say, okay, nothing is happening actually, it's just, people were very afraid based on nothing. It was just the result of fear that was piling up in the press.
André told us how the important institutions of Besançon were transformed during the revolution.
The city was a military garrison where military men and soldiers had a strong impact on the city. It was also a university city, but the university was closed.
Institutions characteristic of the old regime.
Yes, and it was officially closed down. Besançon was also a religious city. There was an archbishop, and his influence went way beyond the borders of Franche-Comté. No more military men, no more students, no more clergy. The city's population collapsed. So indeed, all of a sudden, what was at the heart of the city fell apart.
Given that institutional context, I wondered whether Besançon and Franche-Comté were experiencing the kinds of revolutionary violence that other parts of France had experienced.
Pas tellement. La révolution ici n'a pas connu, je pense, les excès que...
Not really. The French Revolution did not cause the same excess that you can find in other regions, in the West in particular. The guillotine was less active here in Besançon than it was in other regions. There has been a small Vendée in the Haute-Doubs, and there were executions, of course. The revolution, as everywhere else, had different stages.
On l'a vécu en Franche-Comté avec un certain décalage quand même.
I think people living in Franche-Comté were a bit out of sync. This can explain why. But also, some regions were more favorable towards the Republic than others. But Besançon isn't the model of a city where the French Revolution stirred up great change. Of course, those who had immigrated here had their possessions confiscated, but confiscated possessions were largely belonging to the church. The nobility often kept their property. Oftentimes, they would come to an arrangement. Because divorce was authorized in 1792, some couples would choose to divorce to preserve family possessions. When someone in the family immigrated, it prevented confiscation, etc.
Ça évite, quand il y a un immigré dans la famille, ça évite la confiscation.
I asked André if there are folks in Besançon who regret the direction the French Revolution went in.
Oh, de nos jours, je pense pas. Il y en a eu pendant longtemps. Besançon a été...
Nowadays, I don't think so. But there were such people for a long time. Besançon, particularly during the Bourbon Restoration in France, there was a strong aristocratic political movement composed of people who had known the old regime. Besançon and the local elite were completely favorable toward the Bourbon Restoration. The city fell apart, and many members of the local elite immigrated abroad.
Beaucoup des élites locales aussi sont partis en émigration. Il y avait bien sûr...
But of course, a part of the people were very favorable towards the revolution anyway. Different political opinions coexisted, of course. After the revolution, the city evolved, and it became a working-class town. We must not forget that Besançon really became a working-class town during the 19th century, which was not the case during the 18th century. The watchmaking industry develops, as well as the paper industry and the textile industry.
Il y a le papier, les textiles.
They create a new industry in Besançon that is watchmaking. And you have a very interesting wave of chefs d'atelier, so watchmakers.
The masters.
The masters.
The master watchmakers.
And you have this wave from August 1793. And it's very interesting because in less than a year, so you have 80 masters watchmakers coming to Besançon. And in 1794, you have more than 1,600.
Wow, that's so many.
This great wave of immigration is explained partly because people living on the border had a more positive view of the French Revolution, maybe because of the mixing of the cultures and because they were very close to Besançon, they felt the revolutionary ideas coming. Mm-hmm. That's an explanation, but also their industry in Switzerland at the time suffered for a great deal from lack of work, so they really needed work. And so Pierre-Joseph Briot saying, okay, we're creating a new industry is a wonderful opportunity for them. Why would they refuse to come to Besançon? Mm. And what's interesting is how le député, so the Calais, a deputy, through the 21 Brumaire decree, gives these Swiss immigrants the citoyenneté, so they become French citizens. Mm-hmm. They are dispensés du service militaire, so they do not need to go and fight, which is nice. And also it makes it easier for them to find housing. So at the same time that the Franco-Swiss border is such a hot spot for political tension, you have economical development. They feel this great opportunity. French revolutionaries tried to see the French Revolution as an economical opportunity, especially when it came to borders and who was living at the border.
So, we've just mapped out some of the pivotal early moments in the French Revolution. Now we're going to try and zoom in to a very specific story, that of François-Elie de Moustier, the French ambassador to the United States from 1787 to 1789. In 2018, the last time there was a full delegation visit in Besançon from Charlottesville, public historian Léonel de Moustier was one of the people who showed them around, so we knew we should talk to him during our time there. He met us wearing a University of Virginia tie and told us about his friends, the Moustier family.
En fait, c'est une vieille famille d'origine féodale. Donc des origines remontent à l'an 1011.
Well, actually, it's an old family who weren't really connected to the Franc-Comtois aristocracy anymore because their social status was very high, so they were diplomats, etc. Suddenly, there was this opportunity. They were at the royal court, they had ties to the Marquis of Lafayette. Everything works out quite well. He's named ambassador. He's the first ambassador. Strangely, there's a rather funny story, quite comical. He leaves not with his wife, but with a woman he knows well.
Un peu cocasse, c'est que il n'y va pas avec sa femme, il y va avec une dame qu'il connaît bien.
Well, he certainly sounds like he was an interesting character, and I can't wait to hear more. Ben, what made you want to speak with the Moustier family?
Well, at the very beginning of our project, we were really curious about this comparison between Thomas Jefferson and François-Elie de Moustier, so the American ambassador to France and his counterpart going in the other direction. Since I had heard that the family had a tradition and a history of welcoming visitors from Charlottesville and from America to the region in Franche-Comté, that they might actually have a tradition of preserving knowledge and heritage about their family history beyond what many historians might know. And that turned out to be a pretty good hunch.
What did you find?
Oh, wow. So first of all, the family still inhabits the 19th century manor house that their ancestors created, with some 18th century buildings as well that have been turned into a kind of hotel, restaurant, and golf course for events like weddings. And it turned out that the family had also preserved an entire archive and an entire library of papers from their ancestors. They still had an incredible trove of information. On top of that, the patriarch of the family had been getting really into their family's history, into genealogy, and into reading history, and even prepared a kind of genealogical history that ran several volumes that he self-published to give to members of the family and to the community. So I found exactly the right person that we needed to talk to.
Je m'appelle Léonel, Marquis de Moustier.
My name is Léonel Marquis de Moustier, descendant of an old Franc-Comtois family. We have been on the Bournel estate for more than 600 years.
Plus de 600 ans.
The Moustier family, like much of Franche-Comté, did not much like Louis XIV's conquest.
Et on était libre et indépendant. Et au moment, et on était très, très fiers de tout ça.
We were free and independent, and we were very proud of it. Louis XIV's first conquest campaign started in 1676 and lasted 2 years. He returned Franche-Comté to Spain. Everyone was very happy. But the problem is that Louis XIV, bastard that he was, came back in 1678 and reconquered Franche-Comté for good, and it was all over.
1778, et là il a reconquis la Franche-Comté et ça a été terminé.
Even the Moustier family motto is evidence of this focus on freedom.
C'est Comtois, rends-toi, nenni ma foi.
Which translates to, Come toi, surrender nay my faith. In other words, I will never surrender.
In the region, some found creative ways of showing their disrespect towards the so-called Sun King.
Mon aïeul.
Indeed, my ancestor was buried face down in order to look away from the sun. And we still feel very Comtois here, which is why when the prefect of Besançon wanted to visit my father as he was celebrating the bicentennial of the conquest, he was very poorly received by my father, who told him, "But don't you know who we are? There is no way we will celebrate the annexation of Franche-Comté to France."
Nous fêtions le rattachement de la Franche-Comté à la France.
Poor prefect left us with his tail between his legs.
Now that we understand a little more about the Moustier family, let's learn what we can of François-Elie and his time as an ambassador to early America.
François-Elie was my ancestor, and he became Marquis de Moustier.
François-Elie's father wanted his son to become a military man, a knight in the tradition of the noblesse d'épée, the nobles of the sword. He instead became a diplomat, and he rose quickly due to family connections.
First, he settled there. He traveled around, went to Philadelphia, etc. He had close ties with Washington and helped develop the commercial relationship between France and the United States. I believe that this has been particularly important.
La France et les États-Unis, ça a été, je crois, très important. Tout son mobilier qu'il avait.
All the furniture he had in the U.S. at the embassy, he sold it to someone. Do you know who?
I'd say George Washington, if I'm not mistaken. I think I read that somewhere.
Exactly. So to this day, there's still furniture that belonged to my ancestor in the Oval Office.
Oh, so Joe Biden will go and sit on your ancestor's chair.
Yes, you can see it in the pictures. I believe there are 2 chairs which belong to François-Elie in the Oval Office.
Dans le bureau ovale.
So, what did he think of the United States?
Il a trouvé ça extraordinaire.
Well, he found it to be an extraordinary country. He thought that the newly adopted Constitution of the United States was remarkable. And when he came back to France, he wrote a large report and a constitution to Louis XVI, a constitution in favor of a parliamentary monarchy, which Louis XVI did not agree to, unfortunately. He had copied this constitution from the Constitution of the United States. You can find all of this in archival documents.
Of course, we know that the French monarchy did not achieve a parliamentary system at this time.
Poor Louis XVI could not meet these expectations. Unfortunately, well, the consequences were tragic for him and the royal family.
The new American government had clearly made a large impression on François-Elie, and it sounds like he also made an impression as well, though decidedly less positive.
Il n'a pas été très bien reçu parce qu'il est arrivé très imbu.
Indeed, and he was poorly received because he came to the U.S. being very full of himself, saying things like, "I represent the King of France," and representing the King of France meant representing the King of Europe, because at the time France was, in a way, ruling over Europe.
Oui. Donc, il se présentait partout comme...
So he would go around introducing himself as Louis XVI's representative and offering to give unwanted advice to George Washington and the young American Republic. Well, people really did not like that.
Et en plus de ça, sa femme était morte. Elle est morte à 29 ans de la tuberculose.
On top of that, his wife died at 29 from tuberculosis. And you can read in his memoirs that in order to go to the U.S. and play his role as ambassador in Philadelphia, he absolutely needed a woman to maintain the household.
Une femme qui tienne la maison. Et alors il est parti avec sa belle-sœur qui s'appelait la marquise de Bréant.
So he arrived in Philadelphia with his sister-in-law, the Marquise de Bréhan. He had gone to his brother-in-law, the Marquis de Bréhan, to ask if he could take his wife to Philadelphia. The Marquis de Bréhan replied, "Oh, yes, please. She's insufferable. I don't want to see her anymore. Leave with her. She's all yours."
Et avec elle, je vous la donne. Et alors, naturellement, ça a fait très mauvais effet dans toute la bonne bourgeoisie américaine de l'époque.
Of course, it gave a terrible impression to the American bourgeoisie of the time, which is very prudish. But you probably know more about that than I do. Adding to the scandal, she was very Parisian, and she did not make a good impression because she arrived in the U.S. with trunks and trunks full of beautiful outfits bought in Paris, shoes,
Du
etc.
faubourg parisien, etc., avec des chaussures, et on a des écrits de elle où elle est furieuse.
You can find letters written by the Marquise in which she is furious because in Philadelphia, one has only to walk in muddy streets. She writes about how these Americans are appalling. They are but peasants, etc. She treats them
Et
poorly.
donc, lui s'est fait très mal voir du gouvernement, et elle s'est fait très mal voir de la...
Well, he gave a bad impression to the government. She gave him a bad impression to, how can I call it, the local bourgeoisie. And so there are letters in which Benjamin Franklin, who was ambassador of the United States to France, if I'm not mistaken, letters in which the American government writes to Franklin, telling him the French government and the king need to sort this out because he needs to be called back. We don't want to see him anymore.
a écrit à Franklin en lui disant voyez ça avec le gouvernement français et le roi, parce qu'il faut le rappeler, on ne veut plus le voir chez nous.
By the time François-Elie returns from his assignment in the United States, things are really beginning to heat up for the aristocracy in France. Here's Léonel de Moustier once more.
Alors, bien évidemment, il y a une remise complète de l'ordre social, une remise en cause de l'ordre social. C'est vrai
Of course, The entire social order is questioned. That is a fact. Every member of the aristocracy finds themselves negatively affected, abused in Paris, mistreated here and there, forced to emigrate most of the time, with regular destruction, especially archive destruction. What happens in the area around Besançon becomes a national phenomenon. For example, there is an unintended fire that occurred at the Quinsay Castle, a castle that belonged to Monsieur de Moustier. They were organizing a firework. People died. And this marks the beginning of the Great Fear. The event will blow all out of proportion, and people will be led to think it was a plot by the aristocrats to kill peasants. That's ridiculous. In Besançon, the revolution undeniably finds an echo.
C'est le mouvement de la grande peur qui va enfler. Alors, à Besançon, inévitablement, la révolution, elle trouve un écho.
Given his interest in adapting the French system of governance, was François-Elie a revolutionary?
Non, mais vous verrez dans ses mémoires, etc., il était profondément...
No, you can read in his memoirs that he was deeply royalist, but he understood that the system was falling apart. But he wasn't revolutionary in the way people like, I hate him, Lafayette were.
Je le déteste, Lafayette, ou des gens comme ça.
In fact, it didn't take long before François-Elie gathered 2 horses, a carriage, a small cash box, and left for England with his manservant/secretary in tow.
Parce qu'il était le numéro 3 sur la liste des émigrés.
He had to be very careful because, get this, he was number 3 on the list that revolutionaries created on nobles who had immigrated abroad, and that the revolutionaries were hoping to kill. He had to be very careful because, among other things, he had transferred a letter written by the King of France to his brothers.
Pour ses frères émigrés, etc.
La révolution arrive et bouleverse entièrement l'ordre établi, puisque
The French Revolution comes and entirely disrupts the established order, because what will come after the revolution? Besançon is not the capital of Franche-Comté anymore, meaning a great province, but becomes the deux department capital, which means that its area of influence is greatly reduced. The city's elite also saw its power decrease, so members of the elite tend to retreat on their lands a bit more, and without doubt, the empire is a lot more authoritarian.
Beaucoup plus autoritaire.
Il n'y avait plus rien. Et il est rentré en France en 1800.
There was nothing left. He returned to France in 1814-15, after the fall of Napoleon, and he settled in a small house near Versailles, where he lived miserably.
Cité de courrier où il dit au nouveau roi Louis XVIII, vu mes états.
There are many letters he wrote in which he tells Louis XVIII, the new king, considering my service as a servant of the monarchy, you owe me this, you owe me that. He needed money and he died miserably in 1818 or 1817, I can't remember.
18 ou 17, je sais plus.
With the monarchy dislodged, Besançon's role as a military stronghold comes to the forefront of its identity.
Au Premier Empire, ce sont quasiment 250 officiers généraux. Un seul maréchal.
During the First French Empire, we're talking about almost 250 general officers. One marshal, but 250 general officers. But it maintained a sort of glory, a tradition, because during the 18th century, the city was a vast military town, but a lackluster town. With the First French Empire, Besançon became a great stronghold. You may know that Besançon is the headquarters of the 1st Division, meaning that the general commands here. It's the largest stronghold of the land forces in France. The general commands at least 30,000 people. And this we owe to the First French Empire, but also to this time period during the 19th century where France significantly rearmed itself. In Besançon, amongst the generals in command will be the son of a king, the Duke of Aumale, who will command from Besançon and give the city great prestige.
Le duc d'Aumale qui va commander à Besançon et qui va donner un prestige considérable à la ville.
Well, the first takeaway, of course, is that France and America were reciprocally extremely important for each other in the 1770s and 80s. It's hard to get one story without the other. So another really interesting takeaway for me from the conversation with the Moutiers is the emphasis on how much the story of the revolution is also partly a story about the conquest, and how much by this point, by the end of the 18th century, the Moustier family had integrated into the French administration. You can see this kind of generational conflict, that they go from earlier in the century burying their dead face down as a sign of disrespect to the Sun King to serving the monarchy and advising Louis XVI. This is a massive transformation, and in a sense we can read the kind of transitions of these different historical periods and the way the kind of political weather vane keeps turning between different regimes during the revolutionary period through the lives of these individuals in families such as theirs. Another point I was really struck by is how the Marquis de Moustier held together two identities that we might think are contradictory. On the one hand, he feels really strongly that the family is Franc-Comtois, and he also feels really strongly that they're French. I don't get the sense he, regrets the French Revolution, although possibly the excesses of it. It was interesting to see that both of these stories of the conquest and the revolution are both still important for identity in the region.
Ben, what's the significance and importance of remembering the French Revolution?
The people who lived through the revolution felt like they were living through centuries in the span of a decade, that the pace of history had sped up, and also a lot of people that they knew had died. By 1820, you suddenly had this dynamic where some people who were a little older were marked as people who had lived through the revolution, and everyone born since 1800 hadn't. So you have this idea of generations marked by having lived through the revolutions or not. And this is actually the kind of first time the word generation is used in that modern sense. And so it's really during this period in the late teens, the 20s and 30s, during the Bourbon Restoration, that people start to try to grapple with what they had experienced. Like, what did it mean if the monarchy was back on the throne? Had the old regime really been torn apart? What exactly had changed? This was a psychologically very difficult time to be living through. We see this playing out in Besançon as the people sought to memorialize the culture that they had lived through and the transformations that they had witnessed. A great example of this are the collectors who founded some of the most important collections in the Musée des Beaux-Arts et d'Archéologie in Besançon.
So I am Amandine Royer. I am a curator for prints and drawings in the Musée des Beaux-Arts et d'Archéologie de Besançon.
From November 2022 to March 2023, the Musée des Beaux-Arts et d'Archéologie, the Fine Arts Museum in Besançon, put on an exhibition called Le Beau Siècle, the Golden Age, or the Beautiful Century, about the arts in Besançon from the long 18th century that stretched in their telling from the conquest in 1674 to the revolution in 1792, essentially right before the radicalization of the revolution. It happened to be an extraordinarily popular and successful exhibition. I mean, people were really coming out to see the 18th century artworks from Besançon's maybe second golden age.
Well, indeed, it's the heart of the collection, because the first gift of drawings to the city of Besançon happened in 1819 by a man called Pierre-Adrien Paris. Pierre-Adrien Paris was an architect, and he was born in Besançon, and he did all his career in Paris and in Rome also. Jean Gigoux was also born in Besançon. He was a French painter in the 19th century. He was a romantic painter at the beginning, and then his career was very long, so he did quite different things as a painter. He decided to begin a collection of paintings and drawings in the mid-19th century with the aim to give this collection to Besançon Museum. An amazing collection of 460 paintings and 3,000 drawings. So half of our drawing collection here is still from Gigoux's gift.
Do you have a sense of what the public was interested in? Why were they so curious to see these works of art? So is it because this is like the golden age of Besançon and they feel a connection to that?
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
This is really the end of the 17th century and the 18th century are really the golden age of Besançon. You can feel it if you walk in Besançon. You can feel it in the architecture. I think many Besançon visitors feel close to this period, even if it's not always clear in their minds. They were really interested in looking at the plans of the city, of the gardens, of the parks, because there are a lot of parks around the old city center already now, but at that time it was the beginning of the creation of these parks in the city center. So there were a lot of people told us that they were not aware before that Besançon was such a city full of nature 2 centuries before.
Something we noticed when we were walking around Besançon is that it's actually the birthplace of a good number of famous 19th century thinkers and writers.
Oh, absolutely. A statue of Victor Hugo in the center next to the 1802 restaurant, which happens to be the year of his birth. The, family homes of Charles Nodier and streets named after Proudhon and Charles Fourier. So this was remarkable for me. I did not expect this at all, to see so many names that really marked the intellectual and literary culture of 19th century France, especially the early mid part of the centuries. Why don't we start with Victor Hugo first? Do you remember when we went to the Victor Hugo Museum?
Absolutely.
In his birth house?
It's a museum completely dedicated to his entire life's work.
And in some ways, it's a civic museum dedicated to a certain idea of liberalism. They kind of paint him as a figure ahead of his time in terms of advocating for the rights of women and children and toleration and all of these positive virtues. What they don't insist on so much is that he only lived in that house and, in fact, in Besançon for maybe the first 6 weeks of his life, we learned.
Yeah, this actually reminds me a lot of how Charlottesville and Richmond claim Edgar Allan Poe, where he's kind of there for a transient period of time, and yet there are very much dedicated spaces to his memory.
That's right. Like on the lawn at the University of Virginia, they've turned his room into a kind of almost time capsule.
Like a shadow box.
That's right. But he must have lived there for a semester or a year.
Yeah.
Well, I had an interesting conversation with the director of the Victor Hugo Museum while we were in Besançon. I kind of pushed her on this issue a little bit. I said, well, Victor Hugo, he's the one you guys seem the most proud of. You vaunt him everywhere. His statue is the centerpiece of town. But he didn't live here very long, right? Just a couple months. And she sort of sheepishly turns to me and says, oh, yeah, well, 6 weeks, actually. But it's by Hugo's own admission that he's from Besançon, right? He spoke about himself that way, and
yes.
that gives an opening. But I actually think there's a stronger argument for connecting Victor Hugo to Besançon, which is that Hugo's father, Joseph Léopold, was not in Besançon by chance or by coincidence. It's that he is a military man and became an important military officer, first in the Revolutionary Wars and into the 19th century. So even though baby Victor is only there for a couple of weeks, it says a lot about the trajectory of his family and the possibility of ascension through military service. Hugo is connected to Besançon not by necessarily some accident of birth, but by a very deeply rooted, long tradition of the military implantation in this eastern, almost a border town, almost. Well, as for Charles Nodier, Charles Fourier, and Proudhon, they're all interested in different ways in the question of social belonging. Proudhon as a kind of anarchist opposing the state because of a vision of radical equality. Charles Fourier, who's advocating for forms of communal living in extremely intellectually rich ways, and very, very imaginative as a thinker that became the inspiration for utopian communities in America as well. They all kind of make me think there could potentially be a through line here, which is that Besançon had a kind of strong civic identity that it was maintaining, Through the revolutionary period, whereas many cities in the interior of the French kingdom dismantled their fortifications, Besançon kept theirs. This is a kind of symbol of civic identity in part, as the historian Yair Minsker has written about. At the same time, it was still a relatively wealthy city. So I can imagine why Besançon and Franche-Comté was the kind of point of origin for these particular strands of 19th century French thought. It seems plausible, at least. Aside from moving beyond the deification of so-called great men, we start to see the pressure points in historical memory. Was the revolution good? For whom? Was the conquest good? For whom? I can start to see why the Moustier family had this ambivalent attitude about the conquest. Consider what Gaël Cavalli, the communications and archaeology curator at the Citadel, had told us about the conquest from the perspective of Vauban's military forces.
Let's not forget that there were many acts of violence, deaths, attacks, etc. People also do not like when Vauban, as well as the time period he lived in, are overly praised, because it is true that Louis XIV was the absolute monarch, which is why he doesn't have the best reputation in France. But I think that people in Besançon are able to distinguish between this complex legacy and the Citadel as such.
If Vauban and the Citadel came to symbolize Louis XIV's conquest of France, I wondered whether revolutionaries still considered the Citadel to be a symbol of the absolutist monarchy, much like the Parisian mobs would have considered the Bastille prison that perhaps it symbolized royal authority in the revolution.
Not to my knowledge. Indeed, it has always been a military location, occupied by soldiers. So when the power changed, it became the power of the Republic. The army was the revolutionary army, so it had little to do with seigneurial power. I personally think that what people in the country, etc., had a problem with was the seigneurial power. Because of that, I don't think people reacted the same way to military locations. This is also illustrated by research we have done in the Citadel, linked to the chronology of the building. This research has allowed us to date some elements from the well, and we realize that many things were remade or modified in 1790. So on the contrary, the French Revolution was a time when the Citadel was repaired, etc. I don't think that people saw it as a place they needed to destroy.
During our time in Besançon, we visited many, many historic landmarks. And the whole time we're grappling with this history and how it's remembered. But there's one story in particular that we feel encapsulates this question of what role this history plays as we move forward in the modern world.
Here is Gaël Cavalli at the Citadel one more time.
So there's a strong attachment that can also be found in a recent controversy because, as you probably know, our current city council is Écolo. The mayor's political party is the Ecologist Party. And one of the first decisions taken was to turn off the Citadel's lights at night in order to preserve biodiversity and to limit nighttime light pollution. It caused an uproar in Besançon because many people did not understand, considering it's our symbol. Exactly. And so now the city council has started collaborating with a lighting designer in order to find a way to make the Citadel stand out while preserving biodiversity.
This dispute over the Citadel's illumination shows just how deeply people care. In the context of a civic program for middle schoolers, Gaël Cavalli asked students what their attitudes towards the Citadel site were.
At the very beginning, I asked them, "How do you feel about the Citadel? How would you describe it to other people?" They replied, "It's our very own Eiffel Tower."
So that was our last episode about Besançon. Ben, give us your final analysis.
There's a kind of independent streak that continues in Franche-Comté. America thinks it's a free country. That's literally the name of this province. The name itself is performative. It conjures up the liberty to which it lays claim through repetition. It can be used in opposition to any and every regime. You want to oppose the Habsburgs, we're free of you. You want to oppose the French Bourbons, we're free of you, we're going to establish a republic. According to one historian of French national identity, Bernard Gros-Perrin, the province of Franche-Comté was a center for a different kind of federalism, one in which local privileges were respected. As we've seen in the Cahier de Doléances, exemption from some taxes, the right to religious intolerance, that is to say, intolerance of Protestantism, and so on. The province remained what became known as fédéraliste overall, that is to say, they defended the interests of the opponents of Jacobins, who were known as Girondins. And so in that sense, we might consider Franche-Comté to be one of the most American, or at least the most anti-federalist or Jeffersonian regions of France, trying to keep distinct local powers to preserve the privileges that they had under feudal law in the old regime, to not give up certain liberties to the new national government. So much for Moutier and the French story in Besançon. Let's turn to the town of his counterpart, Thomas Jefferson, in Charlottesville, Virginia. Sister Revolutions is a limited-run documentary series made possible by the Charlottesville Sister Cities Commission, Brown Residential College at the University of Virginia, and America 2026. You can learn more about each of these organizations on their websites, CvilleSisterCities.org, browncollege.virginia.edu, and America2026.eu.
Sister Revolutions is produced and hosted by Dr. Benjamin Bernard and Sage Tanguay, with production assistance from Sophia Moore,
French transcription and translation by Oriane Guiziou-Lamour,
and English voiceover by Nathan Moore, Tracy Gerlach, Russ Perry, and Dan Henneke. This episode featured music by Blue Dot Sessions and Daniel Sender.
Charlottesville Sister Cities grantee violinist performing an excerpt by Michel Blavet, composer of 18th century Besançon.
This episode featured the voices of
Léla Tnaïnchi, doctoral student at the University of Burgundy-Franche-Comté, Oriane Guiziou-Lamour, doctoral student in the Department of French at the University of Virginia, André Ferrer from the Société d'Émulation du Doubs and Professor Emeritus at the University of Burgundy-Franche-Comté, Gaël Cavalli from the Citadel in Besançon, Lionel Estavoyer, Léonel the Marquis de Moustier, Amandine Royer from the Musée des Beaux-Arts et d'Archéologie in Besançon.
We'd like to extend a special thanks to Elizabeth Smiley of the Charlottesville Sister Cities Commission,
Gaspard de Moutier, Bertrand van Rumbeck of America 2026,
Professor Ari Blatt, Chair of the University of Virginia French Department,
Florent Verguet, Head of International Relations for the City of Besançon,
and Hugo Tudik, Associate Director of the University of Chicago Center in Paris.
Sister Revolutions is hosted by Symposia, a production of Brown Residential College at the University of Virginia,
and the Virginia Audio Collective at WTJU 91.1 FM.